you've studied the birth books, you've taken all the birth classes, and you've even hired a midwife and a doula. But guess what? That's not all you need to have an empowered birth. And I learned that the hard way when I was birthing Michaela, and I'm going to be sharing that story with you today. But first, I'm going to tell you about the sneaky saboteurs, the little sneaky things that come up in your birth that we don't really think about, especially in terms of how we're planning our birth. And it has to do with our brains. My name is Carly. I am a birth doula, a childbirth educator, and an empowerment coach. And I've been doing this now for 9 years. I've been studying up on birth. I've been in the birth communities, and I've seen the same patterns over and over and over again. What happens oftentimes is that when we want to have a natural birth, we get tricked out of it. And it's not our fault, because the information that we have on natural birth that comes through the mainstream is that birth is painful, and that if you're doing it naturally, that you're basically trying to get a medal. A lot of times what we're taught about how natural birth unfolds, how our labor patterns are, it's not even physiological. And if you want to know more about physiological birth, this book, Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, is an excellent source of information. It tells you a deep dive into every single stage of labor and preparing for labor, and what happens to your brain and what happens physiologically to you, for your baby. It goes into everything. And I've been teaching this inside of my Take Charge of Birth program classes every single Saturday. And my students have been learning. It's like I was this day old when I learned some of this stuff. And I myself, even though I have been in birth work now for almost 9 years, I am also learning a lot more. And it's given me a lot of aha moments and insight into my own birth of what happened with my son. So if you haven't heard my story before, what happened basically is that I wanted to have a home birth, and then I was tricked out of it. I was told that my baby wasn't growing properly. I wasn't given adequate information to make an informed decision on informed consent when it came to ultrasounds, when it came to non-stress tests, when it came to the diagnosis that they gave me of IUGR, or intrauterine growth restriction. They didn't tell me any of that. All they really said was, you can't have a home birth because he won't tolerate labor well. And the implication of that was that if I kept pushing and pushing and pushing to try to have my home birth, or questioning their judgment, that I was somehow putting my experience ahead of the health of my baby. And even my family themselves said, it's probably best if you just have him in the hospital. You want to be safe. So I was told, you want to be safe, and I trusted at the time that they would allow me to have a physiological, natural birth the way that I wanted. And what I found out is that the medical system isn't set up for physiological birth. They don't trust it, they don't understand it, they also don't know a hell of a lot about it. And so when things come up in your labor that deviates from the textbook, that's when they start trying to intervene. And something as simple as walking into the room can also derail your birth. But I'm not going to share about that particular story because that was in the hospital. But what happened afterwards with my home birth with Michaela, because as you know, I was like, this is it. I am determined. I am not going to let them tell me that I can't have a home birth next time. I'm having a home birth. And so for most of my pregnancy, I was in a very fight or flight combatant mode of, don't tell me what to do. I'm going to do this thing and you can't stop me. But on the other side of that, I had that fear of, well, what if the same thing happens again? What if something else goes wrong? And I kept focusing on, what if my labor stalls? What if I get talked into transferring? What if my midwife isn't comfortable? What if I get pushed into vaginal exams I don't want in labor? And you know what? What happened is I ended up actually bringing that into my birth. So when I went into labor, my labor did stall. I did get talked into having vaginal exams I didn't want. And I did almost get talked into having a home birth transfer. And what I had to do is I had to face my fears, and I had to basically rework my brain. Because one thing that isn't taught in a lot of birth classes is that you really need to change your mindset. So I have 5 pillars of empowerment. If you've been following me for a while, you already know them. And for those of you who don't, my 5 pillars are as follows. You need to have the right mindset. You need to have the right education. You need to have the right environment. You need to have the right facilitators, and you need to have the right support. And 3 of those things are really crucial, especially once it comes time for you to give birth, because they affect the education that you get and they affect your mindset. And when you are in labor, you also need to be able to focus on positive thoughts. If your thoughts are on fear, if you're thinking and fearing what's going to happen and you're worrying about your baby and you're worrying that you can't do it, your body is going to respond, and it's going to not be a good experience for you, because you're going to mess with the endorphins, you're going to be messing with oxytocin, you're going to be messing with adrenaline and cortisol and all of those hormones. And then birth is not going to unfold very easily. So in reading in Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage over the last several months and working with my students, I've also come to the insights of why my own labors unfolded the way they did. So with my son, I had a little bit of false labor the week before because I had this fear that I didn't want to go to the hospital. And so ultimately I didn't go into labor. It didn't progress. And then the next time I went into labor, and labor took a little bit longer because I noticed that my midwife was not on call. But then when I got to the hospital and I stayed, I then had the fear that they were going to pester me, that they were going to harass me. And what happened is I continued to get harassed. I got pulled from the tub. I got put on my back because I said, I don't want to be on my back. Basically, I focused on everything that I didn't want instead of what I wanted. And the reason I'm telling you this is because it goes back to the law of attraction. What we focus on gets stronger. So if you're focusing your mindset on what you don't want to happen, it's more likely that scenarios are going to come up. Either your labor is going to stall, or there's going to be a pushy nurse and you're not going to be able to deal with it effectively. And you're going to have somebody say something to you that's going to freak you out. And then things just start to happen and unravel. And there's a danger zone with this, because as I said before, multiple times in my teachings, birth trauma is not what happens to you, it's how you feel about it. So if your thoughts and fears are focused on it as a traumatic experience, it's going to be a traumatic experience. If you're coming to your birth in a place of power instead of a place of fear, even if you end up with a cesarean, if you are the one who planned that cesarean, if you're the one who decided in that moment, this is what's needed and here is how I'm going to ask for what I need in this moment to be able to be comfortable with this birth, then it's not going to be a traumatic experience for you. It might actually be empowering, even if you end up in a cesarean. The same thing goes for induction. Induction does not have to be traumatic. However, the way we think about it and the way that we come to it in that decision-making process, even a natural birth can be traumatic. As I experienced myself with my son, I didn't have any intervention. I was just put on my back. But when I was laying there on the bed and watching the clock, and I was counting the hours that I was pushing, all I could think was, they're going to cut me. They're going to cut me. I'm not going to be able to do this. I can't do this. They're going to say I can't do this. And my birth is going to go down the drain and I'm going to end up in a C-section. Oh my God, why won't they leave me alone? I was so scared. And I just kept watching that clock. And when the midwife said, if you don't push right now, I'm going to give you an episiotomy, I already knew my son was almost all the way out. And I just went for it. But that was still trauma to me. It was more traumatic watching that clock and knowing that I had no power. But if I had simply told everybody, I'm going to do this my way, and you're going to get out of my way and just leave me to do it, sure, they might have been uncomfortable, but I would not have been uncomfortable, because I would have been able to feel that I could ask for what I wanted, regardless of their discomfort. So typically what I do is I take people who want to have an empowered birth. Specifically, they want to attempt a natural birth. They really believe that they can do it. And we just work through those fears, and we work through the fears of how to talk to their care provider, how to create that birth plan, how to communicate with their doula, how to communicate with their midwife or their doctor, how to communicate with their partner, how to communicate with family members who may not be on board, how to get that information that they really need to be able to make decisions on what they want in their care. And then we create backup plan after backup plan after backup plan, so that no matter what happens during their birth, they have a plan for it and they can understand. We also take a deep dive and I teach them all about physiological birth. So that's basically what I do, and that's why I'm drawing from this today, is actually from a class that I taught last week on pushing. So we were talking about the birthing phase and how our brains basically bring us back into the present. And this is where a lot of my trauma came from, which was from the fact that I was no longer in labor land. If you've heard before of some of my other videos, I've also talked about labor land and how if you're thinking, you're not there. And the process of birth, the physiological process, requires you to go inward. Like if you're constantly getting people saying, hey, nitpicking, saying that you're doing this wrong, you're laboring wrong, you're not in the bed, you're on the bed and you're in the wrong position, we need to get in a different position, I need to be able to hear the baby's heart, you're not progressing fast enough, all this stuff, you're starting to get pulled out of labor land and you're no longer trusting your instincts to guide you. You're being guided by other people. And when you're being guided by other people and not the instincts, what happens is that may not have been what your baby needs, because your care providers can only see you and they can only go by the machine. They can't go by what's happening internally. So this is why oftentimes my clients have said, well, I was having a contraction and it wasn't being picked up on the monitor. And the nurse said, oh, well, that's not a contraction. Wait till they get really big. And the fact is that, yes, it actually was a contraction. It just wasn't being picked up by the machine. So the 3 things that you really need to focus on are my 3 pillars of empowerment out of the 5. You need to have that right environment. And if that means that when you come into a hospital room or if you're in your own home and you cover every single clock and you let people know, like, look, you have to use the timer on your phone to find out time of birth, just so you don't actually need to have an accurate time of birth. My daughter, I still don't know to this day what time she was born because we had the wrong clock. I had it like a couple of minutes ahead. So don't worry too much about accurate time, but if you do want to have a timer, have it on your phone. Don't have a clock where you can see it, because time means nothing in labor. So if you're going into the hospital or a birth center, or you're birthing inside of an Airbnb, or you're birthing at home, you want to cover those clocks. You also want to dim the lights. Oxytocin does not like light, and it makes it so that you're distracted and you can see clearer, and it keeps you awake. And what you really want to do is you want to go into that labor trance. You can't go into a labor trance if you're awake. If the lights are on, it doesn't work out. It's just like when you're trying to have sex with the lights on. Sure, it can be fun, but it's not going to be that sensual, deep experience because there's glaring light in your face. This is why when people are birthing and they have the lights on, I'm like, okay, but even a cat goes into a dark corner and hides. And if you turn the lights on, they will go under the bed. We need to be in the darkness. That's why a lot of babies come late at night, or they come early in the morning after laboring all night. The next one, of course, is you need to have the right facilitators. And what I mean by that, besides the fact of hiring your care provider, and I have videos about that as well on how to hire the right care provider, but once you've got somebody who has that ability to support you, you also want to have a dialogue with them, because what they can say to you during labor can make or break your birth, and they don't know what words are going to work for you. So I actually had a discussion with one of my clients where she would feel really triggered if somebody said everything looks good. And the reason she would be triggered by that was because she had had that with her first birth and it had been a lie. Everything was not good. But they kept telling her that she was doing great and that everything looked good, just to not scare her. And at the same time, she did not feel that everything was good because she was on Pitocin. So you really need to think, what are the words and phrases that my care provider could say to me to reassure me if I wanted to be reassured, if I wanted to be assessed? Because remember, assessments and everything are also optional. But if you did choose that assessment, what would you want their words to be? Do you want them to say, if you choose to have a cervical check, do you want them to say you're 6 centimeters or 7 centimeters or whatever centimeters? Or do you want them to say you're making progress, you're doing it? Sometimes you're making progress, you're doing it can be distracting. Sometimes you don't want them to say anything. And it all depends on what you are most comfortable with. So as care providers and facilitators, even as a doula who is then saying you're doing a great job, you can do this, you've got this, that can also be distracting. So having that conversation with your care team ahead of time, and we're talking a couple of months before you even hand them your finalized birth plan, before you're even going to go into labor, that can be incredibly helpful, because then when you get closer to the start of labor, they're not going to say the wrong things that are possibly going to make you fearful, possibly going to make you anxious, and possibly make you go overdue because of the fact that you are now introducing that adrenaline and cortisol. And it's not a great place to be in your last few weeks of pregnancy. It can be very nerve-wracking. You want to be as relaxed as possible so that your body will go into labor in a relaxed state, not an anxious state. Because you can go into labor in an anxious state, but it's going to be harder for you to get into that trance, and you're more likely to have trauma from that, and you're more likely to have more pain from that because you can't let go and you can't relax. And finally, the last one, of course, you need to have the right support. So you're also going to need to have a conversation with your support team. That includes your partner or your parent or a sister or a friend, whoever is going to be with you who is not a doula, as a labor companion. You want to make sure that they are not going to accidentally say something. Like something as simple as, she looks like she's in a lot of pain. Can we do anything about that? Said to your doula or your care provider. Now, your partner wants to support you. They want you to feel comfortable. But it can also be really confronting for them to see you suddenly screaming. And they may interpret that as pain. However, as there was a quote inside of Reclaiming Childbirth as a Rite of Passage, it was basically, sometimes we just want to scream. There was no pain there with this one mother, but she just needed to scream. She was having a VBAC and she was screaming her baby out, and everybody around her thought that she was in pain. And I even told my clients this, is like, if you need to scream just for the sake of screaming, do it. And I myself am also quite loud, and I scream when I need to, or I will say something, or I will just make a movement and it looks like I'm in a lot of pain. Or I'll sob like I can't do this, which is very similar to what I did when I was in labor with my daughter and I hit transition, and just before my waters released, there was just so much pressure and I just sobbed, and it looked like I couldn't go on. And my partner at the time, he interpreted that as, things are really picking up now, like things are really bad. Like, I don't know if she's going to be able to handle this, but I was able to block that out. So that's the other thing, is that you need to be able to focus on your own thoughts. And while in labor, you can be very suggestible and you can pick up other people's energy. You can pick up other people's fears. What you really want to do is you want to have that mindset cultivated long before birth. And so, as I've said, you need to really address those fears and what you really want. What do you want out of this birth? If you're wanting a natural birth, it's not as simple as it's been led to believe. You don't just go and take a natural birth class. You don't even just read this book. This is a great start. This is a great primer to show you exactly how you need to start thinking about physiological birth. Because once you start to think about it and really understand what works, then you can go, oh, okay, so everything I was taught about natural birth is wrong. Pretty much, that's the summary. Everything that you learned about natural birth before is wrong. This book will help you unlearn that. However, as a childbirth educator and a doula, and also a coach who has gone through mindset training and things outside of just the birth world, but emotional regulation, I really have a handle on this. So when I'm reading through it, I get like several aha moments. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, oh, now it makes sense about this. For example, external fetal monitoring. When you have that monitor on, that in itself can mess up your birth and distress your baby. When you're having vaginal exams, that in itself can irritate your cervix and cause you to close up and cause you to stall. When you have an epidural, that in itself decelerates the baby's heart rate. Another thing that I read inside of the book was it was telling about how if you hit the 1 hour mark when you're pushing, and as a first-time mom, you can end up pushing for a very long time. Even if you're having a VBAC, you might push for a longer time than 1 hour. The 1 hour cutoff is not evidence-based at all. As long as you're still doing it, as long as you're still able to push and you're not feeling exhausted and your baby's not actually in distress, you can keep going. However, when you're on the fetal monitor, what happens is that naturally the baby's heart is supposed to decel. And it's supposed to be that way because blood is rushing to other parts of their body to start the physiological process so that they can learn how to breathe on the outside. Remember, the placenta and the cord are giving the baby the oxygen up until the moment of birth. So the physiological process of birthing is when those systems shift gear. However, we have been taught to interpret baby's heart rate is dropping while pushing as a problem, when maybe it's not. So I do encourage you to read this book because it is just excellent. And as you can see, it's quite thick, but it's worth it because once you really understand physiological birth, even if you're just reading the passages on Eve's story, you'll start to really see the connections. And Rachel Reed goes into amazing detail on physiological birth in the second part of her book. So the thing I really want you to take away is this. You need to have your mindset around birth completely altered from what you have been taught in your culture, from society, from the way that our mainstream birth culture depicts birth on TV. In fact, I was just watching Desperate Housewives with my son a couple of nights ago. We were watching the episode with the surrogate / maid who was birthing the baby that for Gabby and Carlos. And I'm sitting there and I'm just glaring, of course, because she's laying there on the bed in the stirrups. You know where I'm going with this. It was another depiction of a medicalized birth with a lot of ordeal and a lot of pain. And I'm like, that is not birth. No wonder she's having a hard time. She's on her back in stirrups. And it's just one of those things, like we've been bombarded with it in our culture. In fact, if there is a bed in the middle of a labor room, like right smack in the middle, the implication of that is that the client thinks that is where they're supposed to birth. And there are some birth centers where they don't even have a bed. They have maybe a floor mat, or they have other things like a pool as the central focus, because whatever is the central focus of the room, automatically when you're in labor, your brain is going to go to that. So again, when you're doing the right environment, you really want to think, how am I going to facilitate this physiological birth? So if you're planning a home birth, you're going to want to set up your home so that it's going to be physiological birth friendly. That means that maybe you move your bed. Maybe you take some furniture out of your kitchen and you have your birth pool in the dining room so that you can connect it to the hose with the water so that it's nice and easy to refill that pool for you. And you don't have to worry that people are going to be hauling buckets up the stairs. Maybe you put curtains up. You can take a line of like a clothes line, and then you can take like some hooks on either end, screw them into the side of the walls, put that hook up, and then you put sheets and clip those up. And you can have miniature curtains. So I had set up curtains around my living room and my dining room so that nobody would be able to disturb me. So I really did set up my environment. Maybe instead of having the overhead lights, you go and you get some little Christmas lights, the Christmas tree lights, the white ones, and you string those up. And you can also do this inside of a hospital. You can take your own little tiny tea lights so that you're not using the bright fluorescent lights and you're not having to worry about that. If you're home, you can use candles. In the hospital, not so much. They don't like open flames for obvious reasons. They do have oxygen tanks. They do have things that it's probably not a good idea to have open flame, but you could probably have some of those little tiny tea lights, the battery powered ones, or little battery powered candles, and that would work just as well. So setting up your environment, making sure that you can move around, making sure that you have access to the things you need. You want to be able to access the toilet. You don't want to be looking at a clock. You don't want any distractions from the outside world. You want it to be a clean environment. So that's where our nesting comes in to play. Our nesting instinct to clean up is so that we can feel comfortable birthing in that place. Talking to your care provider at every appointment. Making sure that you schedule extra time to be able to have these conversations. Even if it's not on their radar yet, you can bring it up to them. And if they say to you, well, we don't talk about that at this appointment, that's okay. You want to talk about it now, and you are the client, you are hiring them. Same thing with your doula. You want your doula to know what phrases to use, what works best for you for comfort. They have their own arsenal. We have our own tools and what we use. But as a doula, I really noticed with my clients that I needed to follow their lead. So this was a very interesting learning experience for me to sit back, hold space, and really only step in when needed. And some doulas, especially new ones, or those who have had a lot of experience, but aren't so used to just sitting back, they may try to do things like, oh, let's try spinning babies. Oh, let's do the stairs. Let's do this. Let's do that. Trying to get you to birth. Oftentimes it's because we don't want you to have an intervention and we're scared. We're scared that the hospital staff are going to come in and they're going to say your time's up, and that's going to derail things. But there's a way to communicate that to you that's not going to be scary. If they're just saying, hey, let's go up and down these stairs, you might think there's something wrong with my body. If they say it to you in a way that says, hey, just to let you know, there's going to be a little bit more pushback if you continue to go this route, and here are our options. We can try this, we can try that, or I can just stand and guard the door the whole time and they can just leave you alone. What do you want to do? What do you want me to do to help you? So having those conversations ahead of time is very important. And as I said, when I'm working with my clients, I'm usually working about 3 to 6 months in, and we're really trying to figure out what is going to be best for them during labor. And I also give them that education. And I was talking to one of my clients a couple of days ago about how she could bring up things to her doulas as well. And of course, your care provider is part of that. And you also want to have conversations with them. Care providers can have a bit of an ego and they may not be used to having those conversations. And that's why you need to have that mindset of, I am in charge. There's nothing wrong with what I want to ask, and I've got this. And having yourself grounded and being able to stay calm even when other people are freaking out. And of course, your partner. You need to have that partner figuring things out. One book, as you can actually see behind me, it's called The Birth Partner. This is an older copy. This is the 3rd edition. I do have a newer one, and it is on Kindle. But this book will also help your partner. So there's things like relieving back pain in labor and showing diagrams. You can also go onto YouTube and they actually show you how to do rebozo sifting, how to do hip compressions. So oftentimes what I do with my clients is I tell them, okay, have your partner watch this video and practice before you even go into labor. So I have them do hip compressions even before labor starts, so that when labor does happen, if that is needed, if they want that, then their partner can do it for them and they know what the heck they're doing. And you're not having to say to them, no, lower, press harder, do this, no. Like, then you're in your thinking brain again. So if you have any questions about this video or any of the other ones that I've done so far, you can send me a message at carly@empoweringmomsbirth.ca and we can talk about anything that's come up for you. I also give journal prompts as well. So if you're needing to do more mindset work to work through your fears and you're like, well, how exactly do I do that? Well, I have a system on how to do that, and I would be happy to walk you through it, and I would be happy to share those tips with you. I'll see you soon.